Hey, I'm back with another civics video that you didn't ask for, but hey, you're going to get it anyway. And this is episode number 23. And we're going to be talking about what does a peaceful transfer of power really mean when it comes to an election. And a lot of people think civics is just memorizing the branches of government and the amendments and all the vocabulary terms and stuff. But civics is really about the power, the rights, the responsibility, and how people govern themselves. And I'm talking about it specifically from an American point of view, especially in a republic. So today I want to talk about slowing that down. This question's worth slowing things down for because it's about what peaceful transfer of power really means. And a peaceful transfer of power means that when one leader's lawful time in office happens to come to an end, power passes to the next lawful leader without violence or force or a refusal to accept the constitutional process. And that's kind of like, it sounds simple, like it's a no duh moment, right? But historically, it's one of the hardest things for governments to do. Power is difficult to give up. And throughout history, leaders have tried to cling to office. They've changed rules, they've used violence, they've ignored election results, they've imprisoned their rivals or treated political defeat as something that simply couldn't be accepted. And that's why the peaceful transfer of power matters so much when it comes to a republic, because it reminds us that public office is not personal property. If you have a president, a governor, a mayor, just a legislator, a board member, they don't own the office in which they hold. They just hold it temporarily. The authority belongs to the people and to the constitutional system, not to the individual person who happens to hold the title. Of course, one of the earliest American examples of this came from George Washington, the American Cincinnatus. If you know, you know. Well, after the Revolutionary War, Washington resigned his military commission and returned to his power over to civilian authority. And that was important because he could have used his fame and his military influence to become something quite a bit more powerful. Later on, after he served his 2 terms as president under the Constitution, Washington stepped away, establishing the 2 term presidential precedent. He showed that leadership in a republic includes knowing when to leave power. Another major example of all this would come down to the infamous election of 1800. For you Hamilton fans out there, your ears just perked up. But we go to John Adams, who was a Federalist. He lost to Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson ultimately wins it all. He was a Democrat Republican. And that election was rather, we'll just say, bitter. The country was young, political parties were still in the developing phases, and the results were quite messy. And the election was eventually decided in the House of Representatives. They took the top 3 candidates, of which Adams was not one. It was Jefferson, Burr, and maybe Pinckney. Anyway, the power still transferred from one party to another, from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. And so this was a major test. And the United States showed that political opponents could fight hard, they could lose, and they could still allow the constitutional process to continue. And this is just one of the things that makes the election of 1800 so important. It wasn't just about Jefferson winning in the end, it was about how the system survived. There's also moments that remind us how fragile this principle can be. After the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, of course, won the presidency, but several southern states rejected that result, and they took the traitorous action of seceding from the Union before Lincoln took office. And then, of course, the Civil War follows. That history reminds us that elections alone just don't preserve a republic. People and institutions also have to accept lawful outcomes, even when those outcomes are deeply unpopular. And then, of course, there's the election of 2000. That presidential election was between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and it was extremely close and disputed, especially in the state of Florida. Hanging chads, once again, if you know, you know. And that legal battle went all the way to the Supreme Court. Many Americans really disagreed strongly with the overall outcome. And Al Gore himself disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision, but he still conceded and he accepted the result. That didn't mean everyone suddenly happened to agree upon it. It just meant that the constitutional process happened to continue. That's an important distinction because a peaceful transfer of power does not require everyone to like the outcome. It does not require people to stop criticizing the winner. It doesn't require people to pretend the election was perfect. It doesn't mean citizens lose the right to challenge laws or to criticize the leaders, investigate the problems, or just argue for reform. But it does require a basic commitment to the lawful process. And I know you're thinking he's leaving out the most, obvious example, but I'm not so sure I want to step on those landmines just yet. But the election of 2020, of course, coming to mind. But getting back to the stream of things here. In a republic, losing an election cannot mean the system no longer counts. If power only transfers peacefully when our side wins, then we don't really have a peaceful transfer of power. We have conditional loyalty to the system, and that's like ridiculously dangerous. The peaceful transfer of power matters because it separates public office from personal power. It says leaders are temporary, but the constitutional system is supposed to endure. It says political defeat is not the same thing as just out and out destruction. It goes on to say that the country, the state, the town, the community, whatever, belongs to more than the people who won the last election. And it goes on to remind citizens that elections are not just contests for the sake of victory. They are part of a larger agreement, perhaps the social contract. Anyway, we're in a system where we can argue and campaign, and we can vote, and we can count the votes according to law, and we can resolve disputes through the legal processes. And then power transfers to the lawful winner. And those who keep their rights, their voice, and their chance to participate again. So that's not weakness. That is self-government. So what does a peaceful transfer of power really mean? Well, it means power belongs to the office, not to the office holder. And it means elections have consequences, but there are limits that still matter. It also means winners take office lawfully, but losers then continue to participate peacefully. It also means that ambition must be restrained by the rules. And so the real civics question is not whether defeat is disappointing. Of course it is. The real question is whether citizens and leaders are committed to the republic even when they lose. That's what the peaceful transfer of power really means. And I really felt like that was another civics question worth asking. Yeah, so hey, yeah, feel free to chime in on the comments for this one. I know some folks may not agree with my overall assessment, but I did try to approach it in a more middle of the road kind of way, if you know what I mean. It could have been really easy to go one way or another on this one, but try to take the grown-up route. Anywho, we can solve all those problems in the comments. Thanks for watching.